This event is organized by scholarship holders of the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation with the support of the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies, IASS, Potsdam. And just a reminder, as mentioned in the agenda, this event is going to be recorded. So if you continue online, it means you are declaring your consent, and we may use the images and material later on. My name is Karina Marzano, and I am a CAS scholar and a PhD candidate at the Willy Brandt School of Public Policy. I'm also a fellow at the IASS. Today, me and my colleague Aryan, we will moderate the discussion about what is the EU-Mercosur agreement, what does it mean for environmental policy, and which are the challenges ahead for both regions. And the format of this event is that first, we will have 10 minutes presentation by each expert, followed by a discussion section with all the participants. So please leave your microphones on mute during the presentations. And I'm very thankful to our experts that joined us today. And I will introduce them in a second. But before that, I'll hand it over to Aryan, who also has some few welcome words.
Hi and hello everybody. My name is Aryan and a warm welcome to our nice event on an exciting topic. Indeed, our today's topic is about more than just a narrow subject matter. It's about trade, about economics and politics, and about environment and climate. However, before directly starting this debate by giving the speaker's gavel to our fantastic guests, I will briefly expound the broader context of our event. As Karina has already pointed out, and as you can read in the description of the event paper, this event is organized by the Scholarship Group 2 of the Department Northeast of the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation with the help of, I'm sorry, my phone is ringing, with the help of the IASS. I want to thank the IASS for this fruitful cooperation. Events like the one at issue are commonly taking place in a real life. It's one thing to speak about issues, but it's a totally different thing to see and sometimes, unfortunately, smell each other in a tight conference room. Nevertheless, I think we will all agree that no virtual event may ever be able to replace the real engagement of us, the people. Since the current legal situation does not allow a real get-together, digital events are temporarily an adequate instrument to substitute physical gatherings. It is up to the individual contribution of each of our scholarship group members to realize events of this kind. Therefore, I want to take the opportunity to thank you, Karina, for the tremendous work done in advance to realize this event. With that said, I'm looking forward to today's debate.
Yes. So thank you very much, Aryan. So let's start with our first speaker. And it's my pleasure to introduce you Carlos Hittel, who is a senior fellow at the IASS, an associate founding member of Brazilian Climate Center and Climate Observatory Lab. And Carlos will talk to us about where exactly is Brazil today in relation to the main pillars of the Trade and Sustainable Development chapter of the agreement. So please, Carlos, the floor is yours.
Hello everyone. Thank you so much, Karina, for the invitation. Thank you for the organization of this event. The subject of this event is also the subject of my research at the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies. I studied the conditions that could hold Brazil accountable to the trade and sustainable development commitments under the trade agreement between the European Union and Mercosur. And it's to be my pleasure to speak a bit about where, as Karina said, where Brazil is standing right now in comparison to the main pillars of the chapter on trade and sustainable development. I'll start sharing my screen. Hopefully it will go through. Do you see there?
Yes, we can see. Maybe just
Perfect.
Okay.
to share it to get bigger. Yes, perfect.
Okay, thank you. This is the summary of my presentation for topics. Well, first of all, I'll briefly speak about some of the main commitments that parties signed for when agreed on the trade agreement, that are included in the Trade and Sustainable Development chapter, and later how Brazil's Bolsonaro is performing against those commitments, and how Bolsonaro's Brazil is performing, and some of the problems that the Bolsonaro government is facing due to exactly his performance or lack of performance on environmental issues, and some of how we can look into 2021 and to understand what could come next in Brazil regarding environment and associated subjects because of Bolsonaro's main priorities for the environmental agenda. Okay, here we go. The EU-Mercosur trade agreement has a whole chapter on trade and sustainable development. And these 2 pages that I'm sharing here are actually one fact sheet about the Trade and Sustainable Development chapter, which includes a series of commitments, including protecting the environment, protecting the climate, protecting human rights, indigenous communities. And I will speak about some of them. For example, translating protecting the environment, for example, to not lower the legal protection for labor or environmental standards, to effectively implement the Paris Agreement, to respect multilateral environmental agreements, including the CITES, the Convention on Illegal Trade in Endangered Species, and to protect human rights in the indigenous communities, and to offer civil society organizations an explicit role in overviewing the implementation of the agreement. I'll speak about some of those main pillars. And I'll go directly to where Brazil is. First of all, you might have read, you probably have read or have seen in media along these last 2 years, a series of bad news coming from Brazil: forest fires, increasing deforestation, also associated with that a lot of violence against indigenous people. Unfortunately, in less than 2 years at office, Bolsonaro's administration took annual rates of deforestation in the Amazon to increasing 47% last year. For the period between August 2019 and July 2020, more than 11,000 square kilometers were registered as clear-cut, complete deforestation only in the Amazon region. This is 282% above a legally binding commitment that is included in Brazil's national policy on climate change, which is states that by 2020, the annual rate of deforestation in the Amazon should be limited to 3,925 square kilometers. This number represents a reduction in 80% of annual deforestation in the Amazon in comparison to a historical baseline. Last year, the rate of deforestation in the Amazon region was the worst in 12 years. Beyond that, beyond what has been destroyed, we have a lot of forests that have been degrading in the region. And only between August last year and January 2021, we had almost 16,000 square kilometers of degraded lands by forest fires, by illegal logging. But this is what we call contracted deforestation, because the degrading lands, degrading forests is the first step towards the future deforestation. So we might see even further or even higher rates of deforestation coming in the coming years. But it's not only the Amazon that is suffering a lot. The Cerrado, Brazilian Cerrado, which is the Brazilian so-called savanna, had an increase in annual rates of deforestation to more than 12% in last year in comparison to 2019 levels. And the Pantanal, which is the largest world's wetlands, lost 45,000 square kilometers that were burned in 2020. These mean that 45,000 square kilometers is about 1.5 times the size of the state of Brandenburg. So some people can have a level of comparison what is happening right now. Another commitment there is included in the trade and sustainable development is the implementation of Paris Agreement on protecting the climate. In 2019 alone, the Brazilian greenhouse gas emissions were almost 10% above 2018 levels. It was the highest in 13 years. And in 2020, of course, we still don't have the whole set of data. Brazilian Climate Observatory produces annual data on Brazilian greenhouse gas emissions, but this takes time to process a whole set of information from different sectors. But we some estimates indicate that we could reach the end of 2020 having a new increase in greenhouse gas emissions, while the world has gone through a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions because of the economic impacts of pandemics. We used to say that environmental criminals, unfortunately, they were not affected by the pandemics. They were operating as usual. They are running their business as usual, and with reduced surveillance from the government. And beyond that, beyond what is happening in the Brazilian greenhouse gas emissions, we have also last year Brazil was among the countries that had to submit a new set of commitments under Paris Agreement, and Brazil was the only country in the world to submit a new so-called NDC, nationally determined contribution for the Paris Agreement, with commitments to 2030, and the submission by Brazil is the only one that reduces the level of climate ambition. Translated this, the analysis from both Brazilian Climate Observatory and Climate Action Tracker shows that there is a reduction in the level of climate commitments. This red area in the graph at the left shows an additional trajectory, additional emissions between 2020 and 2030 if Brazil fulfills its new commitments. This means for about 400 million tons by of CO2 equivalent by 2030 and 3.4 gigatons of CO2 equivalent along this next decade. This is equivalent to 10 years of French emissions that could be added to atmosphere, while Brazil could say that it's still meeting its targets. And also, in addition to that, this means that Brazil could still have increasing its annual deforestation rates and still say that, oh, we are fulfilling our promises to the world's climate community. On protecting human rights and indigenous people's rights, this is the summary of a report that released by the Missionary Council for Indigenous People, which is a branch of a Catholic Church that works with indigenous people, showing the increase of violence and invasions of indigenous lands, an increase in 137% of the case in 2019 in comparison to 2018. Bolsonaro, as president, he took office in 1st of January in 2019. The report for 2020 is still under production. The data are still being analyzed, but it will take some time to release it. But the increase in the first years of Bolsonaro's mandate was absolutely significant. And the violence against indigenous people, direct threats and violence against people, increasing in 152. And there's a a series of bills submitted by the government itself to the National Congress that, for example, opens the indigenous lands to land grabbing, illegal logging, and wildcat mining. This is the sort of pressure that increases, not only attracts invaders to the indigenous people's lands, but also increases the level of violence against them. And regarding the role for civil society, I would just, I could have several slides about that, but I'll just summarize what's going on there on the Bolsonaro's administration for civil society with these two images. In the left is the image of the news. President Bolsonaro referred to NGOs in the Amazon as he has cancer that he can't kill. And his government is taking a series of measures that aims to control the NGOs that are operating or working in the Amazon for the protection of forests, for the protection of indigenous peoples and local communities. And this a leaked plan from the government showing that Brazil, the government of Brazil would like to control 100% of the organizations operating in the Amazon, meaning that some of them could be prevented to work or shut down. More than 60 members of the European Parliament sent a letter to Vice President of Brazil raising concerns. This was late in November last year, raising concerns regarding those plans and speaking about the role of civil society as recognized by the European Union for the democracy, to keep governments accountable to their obligations. And well, what's happening is that Bolsonaro's government is taking to court. This is a reference from November last year. 7 political parties brought an action against the violation of the fundamental constitutional right. Fundamental constitutional rights that is all Brazilians have the right for a healthy environment. And 7 political parties sued the government at the Supreme Court because a national plan to combat deforestation in the Amazon was put on hold since President Bolsonaro took office. And there are at least 3 other legal cases against the Bolsonaro's government to do environmental setbacks at the Brazilian court. But the problems of President Bolsonaro are not restricted to Brazilian Supreme Court. And in the beginning of this year, in January, Bolsonaro was denounced for crimes against humanity by Brazilian indigenous leaders such as Cacique Raoni, or Raoni, Chief Raoni, and human rights groups urging the court to investigate the president because of the dismantling environmental policy and also because of the violations of indigenous people's rights. And okay, I'm reaching the end of my presentation, and these are the priorities of President Bolsonaro for the environment. Some of the priorities, but I start with sharing the forecasted national budget for 2021 for the environmental actions from the national government of Brazil, and this is the lowest budget in 21 years. And so the level of commitment and the level of actions are not going to increase, and to put us in a better situation than where we are right now. And among his policies, priorities at the National Congress are, again, to legalize wildcat mining in indigenous lands, to legalize illegally occupied public lands till 2018, areas that have been grabbed, illegally occupied, that are up to 2,500 hectares, could be legalized if some of his measures sent to the Congress are approved, and also to weaken Brazil's environmental licensing procedures that would affect projects that needs to fulfill a series of environmental obligations. when this refers to large infrastructure projects, mining, agribusiness projects as well. And this is the photo in the news of President Bolsonaro meeting the new heads of the lower house and the Senate in Brazil. And both of them are allies of the president, political allies of the president. And these will make things easier for his priorities to move on. And that's basically this, but I'll leave a question to the floor, which is, considering everything that I shared, is Brazil ratifiable, considering the Trade and Sustainable Development Chapter, or the trade agreement between EU and Mercosur and its sustainability goals? I'm afraid it's not. That's it. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Carlos. We are going to have time for discussion, but first we are also going to hear from our other experts. But thank you for painting this very clear picture of where Brazil stands in respect to the environmental commitments in the trade agreement. I think it's important to remember that this is the first time that the Mercosur countries, they agree to environmental provisions inside a trade agreement. But now we will hear from Sofia Paulini, who is a PhD researcher at the Department of International and European Union at Erasmus University in Rotterdam. Sofia recently coordinated an academic statement in which Carlos and we participated, and the document makes practical proposals to address environmental issues raised by this trade agreement. So maybe Sofia can tell us a little bit about the key priority issues and political challenges from the EU perspective, and how this agreement set the stage for future trade and environmental negotiations. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Karina. I will also share my screen. Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this great event. I would like to use my time to give you a bit of a general overview of how environmental considerations are incorporated into the EU's recent free trade agreements, such as the EU-Mercosur Association Agreement, which I will abbreviate as EUMAA, if that's okay for you. And then, yeah, as Karina already said, we worked together with Carlos on an academic statement in which we make some proposals on how environmental considerations could be strengthened in the agreement. And yeah, I would like to present some of these proposals to you as well. So first of all, I would like to discuss a little bit on a conceptual level what is actually the interrelationship between trade agreements and the environment. So why do we talk about the environment in the context of a trade agreement like the EUMAA? So a free trade agreement is basically an agreement by which parties grant each other preferential trading conditions with the objective to intensify trade relations, which means to trade more goods and services with one another, which is then supposed to translate into economic growth in the parties that participate in the agreement. And of course, this begs the question of the impact this rise in commercial activities has on the environment. So will there be a corresponding rise in CO2 emissions? Will there be any other environmental degradations as a consequence to the coming into force of a new trade agreement? But these considerations also lead us to another question, which is whether a free trade agreement could actually be used to push trade in sustainable goods and services by creating incentives or preferential conditions for these types of goods and services, rather than perpetuating unsustainable production and consumption patterns. So the EU-Mercosur agreement, EUMAA, is among a number of trade agreements that the EU has been negotiating over the last years. trading rules actually have long been negotiated on a multilateral basis. So first within the GATT and then within the World Trade Organization, the WTO, which was created in the 90s. And in this multilateral fora, environmental considerations played a very limited role. I'm happy to discuss it a bit further if there's any interest, but yeah, it hasn't been considered, the synergies between the two policy areas haven't been exploited, let's put it that way. But negotiations within the WTO stalled in the last years, and states like the EU, who wanted to negotiate more trade liberalization and more market access for themselves than was already taking place within the WTO, went on to negotiate smaller agreements on a bilateral and plurilateral basis to achieve this further trade liberalization and this further market access. And this is the so-called new generation of trade agreements. So just to give you a bit of an idea what they actually do and what they actually contain. So they remove tariffs for most goods that are traded under the agreement, and for the remaining ones, they decrease tariffs quite dramatically. They simplify customs procedures. They cover an extensive breadth of subject matters that are only indirectly related to trade, such as intellectual property rights or competition policies. They reduce non-tariff barriers. Non-tariff barriers are basically regulatory barriers to trade. And they establish committees within which the parties cooperate, exchange information, and even create new rules. So this is all, as I mentioned before, basically a granting of preferential trading conditions in order to intensify trade relations. So I already mentioned that within the WTO, environmental considerations didn't play a big role. However, with this new generation of trade agreements, the EU Commission, which is the institution of the EU that has the mandate to negotiate trade agreements, officially acknowledged the relationship between trade and the environment, as well as other aspects of sustainable development, such as labor standards. And this it did by including a chapter on trade and sustainable development in its trade agreements. So what's important to note is that these trade and sustainable development chapters, which I will abbreviate as TSD chapters, sorry, in trade policies, there's so many abbreviations, but I hope you're patient with me. So the TSD chapters of EU free trade agreements are all very similar. They may differ here and there when it comes to details or the specific issues that they address, but they all follow the same general blueprint, and their approach to addressing sustainability is identical. My assessment of these TSD chapters is that they're very weak in substance and also in the institutional framework. So rather than integrating sustainability aspects throughout the entire agreement, labor and environmental content is placed in a separate chapter, which I don't think is a good idea. And rather than conditioning trade on the basis of sustainability standards, these chapters focus on the domestic law and policy in the respective parties to the agreement. And the provisions themselves are quite weak, mostly preambular declarative language that is not enforceable, also a lot of best endeavor comments, and even the provisions that are a bit more robust in their legal bindingness, they tend to be very broadly phrased, and therefore their effectiveness is questionable. Just to give you a bit of an idea, Carlos already addressed some of the content of these TSD chapters, but these three provisions are typical commitments in TSD chapters that you will find in all recent EU FTAs. So in the first one, you have the obligation not to waive environmental laws. And the objective of such a provision is basically to avoid a race to the bottom in environmental legislation to attract trade and investment. However, the problem is that the reference point that is used for this commitment is the domestic law as it is at that moment in time. So the moment of time when the trade agreement comes into force. But there's no assurance that the environmental law is actually good, it's actually adequate at that moment in time. Then the second provision is that is basically an example of best endeavor commitment that I just mentioned. So the obligation to strive to do something. That is also a provision that is very difficult to enforce because it's very, very difficult to prove legally that a party is not striving to do something. Then the third provision, the obligation to effectively implement the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. In principle, the incorporation of the Paris Agreement in a trade agreement is a very good idea in my view. However, my issue with this provision is that it is not very clear what precise obligations can be derived from it. I think it's very ambiguous because the Paris Agreement sets out obligations of conduct rather than results. So to me, it's, for example, not clear whether on the basis of this provision, the parties actually have to comply with the NDCs that they have reported. The institutional weakness that I mentioned is largely due, not exclusively, but largely due to the dispute settlement of the TSD chapters. What's important to note here is that the TSD chapter is exempt from the ordinary dispute settlement of the rest of the agreement. The TSD chapter has its own dispute settlement. And while most of the steps of this particular dispute settlement for the TSD chapters are quite similar to the ordinary dispute settlement, there's one very important difference, which is for the TSD chapters, there's no mechanism to enforce compliance. So for example, if we go back to the third provision to effectively implement the Paris Agreement, in my opinion, if any of the parties to the agreement withdrew from the Paris Agreement, that would be a clear violation. So I said before, this provision is a little bit ambiguous, but I think that would be clearly a violation of this commitment. However, since there's no mechanism to enforce compliance, if a party to an EU FTA did withdraw from the Paris Agreement, there's nothing that the other party could do. So the other party would have to keep granting the party that withdrew from the Paris Agreement with preferential trading conditions. So in the workshop that we mentioned before, in which we created this academic statement, we found that this weak approach of the EU in integrating sustainability content into its FTAs is particularly problematic in the context of EUMAA. And some of the reasons I'm listing here, of course, the issue of rising deforestation rates, Carlos has discussed, and then the fact that the EU is actually a major importer of deforestation risk goods. Then we have the issue of this agreement going to be among the largest inter-regional trade agreements globally without actually changing anything about consumption patterns, production patterns, or transportation patterns. And also in our workshop, we identified the asymmetry of the trading relationship between the EU and Mercosur. So the EU is mainly exporting medium and high value goods to the Mercosur region, but the Mercosur is mainly exporting agricultural and raw materials to the EU. So we identified that this asymmetry might have a big impact on the sustainable development of the Mercosur region. So we came up with some proposals on how these environmental issues could be addressed in the EUMAA. And we proposed to actually conclude some pre-ratification commitments. So given the risk that the EU-Mercosur agreement itself will be another factor leading to even more increased deforestation, there's a few reports that actually project that. We recommend that there should be some pre-ratification commitments negotiated that should be complied with before the deal is ratified. So on the EU side, we recommend as a pre-ratification commitment that the EU should cooperate with the Mercosur region and set up some technical assistance and funding in order to create a sustainable forestry management system. We also recommend for the EU to take legal steps to ensure that commodities that have been produced or extracted from natural forests or land that shortly before constituted natural forests are not placed on the EU market. So this could be done by imposing mandatory due diligence rules for EU companies. And on the Mercosur side, we recommend as pre-ratification commitments that Mercosur substantially decreases deforestation rates in the Amazon and other biomes. And we recommend to use benchmarks that are proposed by the civil society community in the Mercosur region. And we also recommend as a pre-ratification commitment on the Mercosur side, the protection of the rights of indigenous people that are put at risk by deforestation activities. Other recommendations that we're making is to address this ambiguity that I discussed before with relation to the incorporation of the Paris Agreement by imposing suitably specific, actionable and unambiguous commitments of the parties to adhere to the Paris Agreement. We also recommend strengthening the dispute settlement. As I just said, there's no mechanism to enforce compliance, so no sanctioning. So we propose to come up with a system where sanctions can be imposed following violations of environmental commitments. And we also would recommend that complaints can be lodged by civil society. At the moment, complaints on the basis of violations of labor commitments and environmental commitments can only be lodged by the parties, by the governments themselves. We also argue that environmental objectives need to be interwoven into liberalization and regulatory commitments throughout the entire agreement. For example, by way of tariffs. So using tariffs to create a positive relationship between trade and the environment, which could be done by having lower tariffs for sustainable goods. We also argue that goods and substances that have already been banned from the EU market on the grounds of their risk to human and environmental health should not be permitted to be exported to the EU's trade partners like the Mercosur region. So for example, pesticides is a very pertinent example of this. We recommend to address the asymmetry that I just discussed by creating mechanisms to ensure that the costs of the sustainability initiatives are shared, equitably shared along the supply chain. And also that assessments are made where inequitable practices and value capture is taking place. What we also found very important is to actually improve the evidence base in relation to environmental impacts of trade agreements. So we don't actually know what are the environmental impacts once the trade agreement comes into force. So we recommend to have really robust ex ante as well as ex post assessments being done in relation to the environmental impacts. And lastly, we're also arguing for civil society organizations to get a stronger role in the institutional mechanisms of trade agreements. So I already mentioned that they should be able to bring complaints in case they detect a violation of one of the commitments like one of the commitments pertaining to environmental protection or labor violations. But we think they should also be involved in assessing the impacts of the agreement and have stronger communication channels to actually report on any sort of impacts that they find following a trade agreement. So I'm happy to go more into depth in relation to each of these proposals if anybody is interested. But yeah, that's it for the proposals. I don't know if anybody else is going to discuss the political developments at the moment, so where we're at in the regulatory pipeline. Otherwise, I could also say a little bit about that.
Yeah, I would say we leave this discussion about the political challenges and how is the negotiation so far for the discussion.
Yeah,
after the last speaker.
Okay, yeah, then thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to any questions.
Yes, thank you very much, Sophia, for your contribution. I'm already really looking forward to our debate, but however, we still have a nice guest. So let me introduce you to our next expert, Johannes Brack. Johannes is an MPP candidate at Hertie School of Governance in Berlin. I can see here at least 2 other students of the Hertie School, my friend Niels and Köhn. So maybe you folks want to connect yourself after the event, and so that this event contributed to the connections of the Hertie School. Before starting to study at Hertie School, Johannes graduated from Leuphana University of Lüneburg, where he earned a bachelor's degree in business administration and a master's degree in management and engineering. Johannes spent a long time in South America, certainly in Argentina. There he worked for a member of the Argentine Chamber of Deputies. Sorry that I'm not using the native word of this chamber, but it was too hard to spell, too difficult. So maybe you want to spell it now. Or I can
I think it's the Honorable Cámara, Honorable Cámara de Diputados Nacionales, something like that.
Yes, so thanks for
Very
that.
difficult.
Yes, of course. In particular for me, my language skills in Spanish and in Portuguese are very bad. So Johannes, you had not only the pleasure to make experiences in foreign shores, since you was an intern at the office of a member of the European Parliament, if I rightly remember. So with that said, I'm really looking forward to your contribution, and I will now share my screen because there was an issue with you sharing your screen. So I hope that this is working out. And every time, if you want the next slide, please just say next slide, Johannes.
All right, Ariane, thank you very much for the invitation. Also for the IASS to hosting this discussion tonight. I will talk about the EU-Mercosur Association Agreement, or EUMAA, as nicely introduced by Sophia. And on the next slide, you can see my my overview. I will just give you a brief overview of my relationship with Latin America, then go into the current issues and challenges that I see from the EUMAA, and then give you a quick glimpse into the European and Latin American ties and why they last long, and then I will conclude. Next slide. Aria already mentioned the Cámara de Diputados, the Argentine Parliament, but my relationship with Latin America started in 2006 when I did a Rotary Youth Exchange in Tijuana, Mexico, at the German Council on Foreign Relations, the Young DJP. I organized and moderated discussions with the former ambassadors of Mexico, Brazil, and the still incumbent ambassador of Venezuela. And since 2015, I'm a member of the German Business Association in Latin America, the Latin America Verein, based in Hamburg. Next slide, please. So now, my 2 current issues I see, I will go into Corona and beef production. Next slide, please. Corona, or COVID-19, has a severe impact in Latin America. I just brought you some figures. 18 million infections were detected in the region, more of 12 million in the Mercosur, 500,000 deaths in Latin America and Caribbean, and more than 290,000 in the Mercosur countries. COVID-19 brought Latin America in 60 million people into poverty, and the IMF estimates a full recovery in economic output will be reached in 2023 and in GDP per capita in 2025. And I believe that these circumstances that the COVID-19 pandemic created make the region particularly vulnerable to prefer fast economic growth over sustainable when recovery or during its recovery. Next slide, please. And yeah, one great issue is in this agreement is beef. Actually, I read it in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. It's a trade agreement of beef against cars. So beef is certainly a crucial issue, and there are two main blocks: environmental and climate activists on the one hand side, but also on the other side there are agricultural lobbies who argue that the current imports from Mercosur to EU, which are about 200,000 tons with duties included, that yeah, the additional agreed quota of 99,000 tons will cause problems to European farmers. And I brought you the figures. On the right side, you can see in a graph by the Meat Atlas of the Heinrich Böll Foundation. In purple color, the production in Brazil and also in the EU. And with these figures, I believe that a suspension of the EU-Mercosur, would it have a serious impact on Brazilian meat and beef producers? I don't think so. Would it, the additional quota of 99,000 tons distort European beef markets? I don't think so either. Next slide, please. So now my main challenges I see for Europe, but also within the EUMAA are China and gender neutrality. Next slide, please. And with regard to gender neutrality, the agreement, EUMAA, the agreement text mentions a lot the promotion of gender equality. Now, this is of course a very good objective. However, trade policies and agreements are not per se gender neutral, and they affect women and men differently, and they can increase gender biases and discrimination. And I think the EU should put an emphasis here, because gender neutrality in trade and in trade agreements can boost gender equality. For instance, by developing gender lenses for business sectors which are affected by trade agreements. Next slide, please. Yeah, and besides machismo, which is unfortunately still in Latin America, why gender is an issue in Latin America. And I brought you these two graphs. On the left-hand side, you can see the rate of women killed by partners or families members, also known as feminicides. And after Africa, America's region is in the second spot with double figures than more than double figures compared to Europe. And on the right-hand side, I brought in a graph from the International Labour Organization showing unexplained gender pay gap among Latin American countries. And yeah, we can see that there are persistent gaps between the payment between women and men. Next slide, please. Yeah, China and Latin America. I brought you this picture by Peter Frank from The Economist from an article in 2017, because I think it highlights nicely Latin America and its relations with the Trump administration, which is gone now, but Trump was rather considering building walls or insulting Latin American countries. And China, on the other hand, yeah, was trying to, or was building bridges, is coming with an empty shopping cart and pockets full of money to the continent. And if you look for the Europeans, well, I don't see them. And I think this is nicely illustrated here. Next slide, please. And as The Economist stated in that article, China is in Latin America for the long haul. And it's already the largest single trading partner of the Mercosur bloc and the second largest trading partner for Latin America. And China is also, besides trading, China is acting as an investor and lender to Latin America. For instance, in 2015, China announced that it wants to more than double its investment in the region. And Brazil and Argentina, the two main players in the Mercosur bloc, have loans with China of more than 28 and more than 18 billion US dollar respectively. And now in COVID times, another crucial thing I think which is worth mentioning is the vaccine, so-called vaccine diplomacy, which besides Russia, China is also enacting in Latin America. For instance, the Chinese company Sinovac received large orders from Brazil, from the Brazilian government, and the CanSino one-shot vaccine China is developing or developed is tested in Mexico. Next slide, please. Yeah, before I come to my conclusion, I just come to this short glimpse of why European and Latin America have long ties. Next slide, please. First, I think if we look to the trade bloc, Mercosur, compared to other trade alliances in the region, for instance, the most prominent is, I would say, USMCA, the former NAFTA agreement. Mercosur tends to be more likely to the EU. For instance, it is a customs union, and also it deals with issues such as the facilitation of residency, travel, or work, for instance. And Europe and Latin America share views on democracy and rules-based multilateral order and rules-based trade order, I would say. On the right-hand side in the graph from the Global Democracy Index from this year, Economist edition, you can see, if you take a global view, that compared to Latin America and the African continent and Middle East, but also in some parts of Asia, that I would say the democracy is more spread than in Latin America than in other regions. Of course, as Carlos nicely elaborated with regard to Bolsonaro, I think we can clearly state that Bolsonaro's views are not, democratic, but also, as we can see, that NGOs are acting in Brazil. I think this is a sign for a vivid civil society, and the civil society, I think, is also a very important component of a democracy. Next slide, please. Yeah, from my time in Mexico, but also in Argentina, and also some trips I did to Brazil and other Latin American countries, I would say that between Europe and Latin America, we have deep entrenchment, long relations, and deep cultural bonds. And also what I recognized in my research for this presentation is very strong presence of European cultural institutes and language centers in the region. And when I had a look on with regard to diplomatic ties, I found it interesting, and I brought this small overview of honorary consulates in Mercosur states, taking Germany, China, and the US as an example. And I found it very interesting that that Germany has such a large presence in the region, in particular in Argentina and Brazil, while only the US has 3 honorary consulates in Brazil. Now, honorary consulates, it's, I think, debatable what their influence might be, but as Paul Wittmer, a Swiss scholar and former diplomat for Switzerland, stated that honorary consulates enable personal encounter, and this is the real strength, actually, of diplomatic and consular relation. Next slide, please. So to my conclusion, if you remember my first slide, I put a question mark and an exclamation mark behind the EU-Mercosur deal. And I'll put this get rid of the question mark. Next slide, please. So I believe that if the EU-Mercosur or EUMAA is suspended, I believe the EU proves other potential trade partners in the world as an unreliable party in trade agreements. I think the EU, if the EU abandons Mercosur, that other powers, in particular China, will take advantage of this situation. China, which the EU called a systematic rival, the EU loses its ability to set standards. The standards will be made by others. Now, I think the EU should remain definitely in talks and negotiate, and first underscore the importance of the Amazon. And I think also search for possibilities to incentivize Amazon states. Of course, Brazil has the largest chunk, but it's not the only country in the region. To incentivize these states to recognize its impact and the impact of the Amazon as a global tipping point. Furthermore, I think the EU should adjust its trade policy with regard to gender neutrality and integrate it in its trade agreements. And on the road of finalization of EUMAA, the EU, in my view, should attempt to mitigate COVID-19's impact in the region, and as a trust-building measure, consider a distribution of European distribution of vaccines. Next slide. So thank you, danke, gracias, obrigado. I look very much forward to your questions, views, and thoughts, and look forward to keep in touch also via LinkedIn and Twitter. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Johannes. I think that the three presentations, they were very complementary. For example, your beef case is one of the examples of the trade asymmetry that Sophia was talking about, and some even describe the EU-Mercosur trade agreement as a cattle for car type of deal.
Yeah.
And also thanks for introducing the topic of gender equality and the Chinese presence in Latin America. So now we will start with our Q&A session. We have still about 30 to 40 minutes. And I invite all the participants to raise your hand in the chat. And I will call your name. So please, when I call, unmute yourself, tell us your name and ask your question. We will collect 3 questions each round and turn back to the experts for the answers. You can either use the Zoom reaction to ask a question or write in the chat that you want to ask a question. Does anyone is brave enough to be the first one? I saw, yeah, okay. I saw one hand here. Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, please.
Hi, so thank you for your presentations. I enjoyed it a lot. And I was just wondering, also considering the political side of things, I think the trade agreement has received a lot of criticism, not just from the countries in Latin America, but also from the side of the EU. And what is the likelihood that it will actually be ratified in the future? Because I think that the initial reactions already have been very skeptical, and I think the political circumstances, the political setting, it doesn't look very positive either. So maybe someone could give some sort of insight on that.
Yes, thank you, Cohen. It gives Sophia then the chance to talk about the political developments. Let's just see if we still have some more questions. I would like to collect 2 more so the participants could have their turn. So I know, Verena, did you want to unmute yourself? Do you have a question? No? Okay, I know Arjen has questions, so maybe Arjen, you can.
Yeah, maybe I can. I really want to say I wanted to wait because our guests should be able to ask their questions. But okay, maybe I can start. So very nice presentations, really enjoyed it. I have a question. because I am a lawyer, or basically I want to become a lawyer. So for me, legal standards are very important, and also not only in a procedural manner when it comes to debating a case, but also on an abstract level. So philosophical considerations of legal elements. And I really wonder, because, and it is, very friendly asked, it's just for me important to know your perspective. But I mean, the system of democratic legitimization, where people decide in elections which political ruler they want, is actually the idea that this process solely should decide who are the representatives of a nation. So I really wonder on which grounds we can promote civil organizations in a country like Brazil, because these civil organizations has not any kind of democratic legitimation at all. So a critical question, I'm really curious to hear your answer.
Okay, so we now have 2 questions. Is there any other question, or I'll then give the speakers the chance to make the remarks? So I don't see any hands. So I'll start with the same order of, I see a hand, Laura Moreno. Yeah, Laura, please.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. That was really interesting. I was wondering about the power relationship between the Mercosur and the European Union relationship. Some of the subjects was mentioned, but also the big question is, in comparison with China or other potential associates, what is the concept of this power relationship? What have Latin America to offer in this relationship in order to make more equal negotiation, are not one top-down negotiation with the European Union?
Okay, thank you very much, Laura. So back to the speakers, we should, as a suggestion, follow the same order of the presentation, starting with Carlos, then Sophia, and then Johannes for the answers and comments.
Okay, I will speak a bit about the first question related to the process, because I'm sure Sophia will touch on this and speak on this, and she has the whole picture of the process, and then have the options where it could, how it could move forward. Basically, while it has received a lot of criticisms, we need to bear in mind that right now, Portugal, the government of Portugal, has the presidency, rotative presidency of the EU Council. And it's one government that had been several times expressing its support for the ratification of the agreement. And so it was among the governments that has set some pressure over the German government while it was holding the 6 months presidency of the EU Council. And this is one element. Second, the natural process would demand and require that it was the agreement to be not only approved by the EU Council and the EU Parliament, but it should, in theory, also be approved by each of parliaments of EU member countries. However, one possibility that is under consideration is to split the trade pillar of the association agreement from the other two, which is political cooperation and political dialogues and cooperation. And if this happens, this is under legal assessment, this would mean that it wouldn't be necessary for the trade pillar to enter into force, to go through each of the different parliaments. Only if the EU Council by single majority, and the EU Parliament approves the trade agreement, it would be ready to go if Mercosur countries also did the same. And right now, there's no chance of the trade agreement to be not ratified by the Brazilian Parliament, especially because we have about 40% of the members of the parliament are somehow tied with the agribusiness sector, supported by or representing they're interested. So basically, I would say that, and I'm sure that Sophia has much more to share about that. Regarding the who is there and representing the country, it's really interesting, Arian, to hear you say that, because EU is somehow selling this, why the agreement is so important is because it's among countries, it's not among governments. However, as I shared, even considering that the civil society could have a role in the monitoring of the implementation of the dispute mechanisms related to the trade and sustainable development chapter, we are sure that it is not going to happen in Brazil, and we are sure that it's not an agreement among countries. It's governments are signing the agreement. They have the mandate, yes, but also a series of commitments that are there includes rooms for civil society participation, and also, for example, respect to indigenous people, respect for indigenous people's rights, respect to indigenous people's rights. And this is not only, it's not happening right now, as I shared, the increased violence against indigenous communities, but also these people have not been heard during the discussions of the agreement between parties. You have not consulted, not even the sustainability impact assessment study that was developed by the London School of Economics consultancy, consulted the indigenous peoples groups about, okay, will this trade agreement really end in ensuring that your rights are respected? No, they haven't been consulted. And so there's some, let's say, rhetoric there exercised by the EU right now, saying, and even the EU is investing a lot on a series of workshops in Brazil, gathering civil society groups to provide them an impression that they are being heard. During these workshops, people can share their views and share their concerns and give us a lot of suggestions. But unfortunately, this is happening just after the agreement was signed. And so everything that is being proposed, including our own statement, academic statement, some of the proposals would demand reopening the trade agreement for to include a series of new rules there. And the part of the governments, including the EU as a bloc, has already said that this is not going to happen. And I think that's basically that. And who was the third one? Who raised the question?
Was Laura, about the unequal power between the region.
Well, once again, but very briefly relate to that, on the unequal power, I would say that it was not because of the weight of the power of Mercosur countries in comparison to a, let's say, much more economically powerful bloc that we have, let's say, commodities that could benefit from the agreement being exported by Mercosur countries to Europe, while we have cars, parts, technology, pharmaceuticals, and a series of other products. About 90% of the products exported by European companies to Mercosur countries could somehow benefit from the agreement. It's not because of that. I would say that because of the balance of power there in the countries, such as in Brazil. As I said, the agribusiness sector is the one who has about 40% of representatives of the National Congress. This is a huge power. And then they just put their willing there in the table. And this, the agreement was negotiated for about 20 years, but the last round of negotiations is starting in 2016, exactly in the moment where the agribusiness representatives, the so-called Rural Caucus and the Brazilian National Congress, got much more power because of denounces of corruption against our former president, and they had enough votes to prevent the president to be investigated. Basically that, and I would say that the lobby forces in the other Mercosur countries are also, the other Mercosur countries are also has very strong, very powerful agribusiness sectors, and they were there, the ones who set the pressure and put their conditions. Okay, if this moves ahead, we'll be happy. Basically, I would say, rather than say, oh, European imposed everything that, and Brazil, Paraguay, Argentina, and Uruguay had to accept that. It's not exactly that, in my opinion. Thank you. Sorry for taking too long.
Thank you, Carlos. Now, Sophia, you have any comments?
Regarding the first question about the likelihood that this agreement will actually happen, just to add to Carlos' comments, that the so an association agreement on the EU side has to be agreed upon by every member state in the council. So unanimity in the council. That's due to the type of the agreement, because it has so many political components. However, as Carlos said, the Commission sees that it's going to be very difficult for every single member state to agree. There's a number of member states that are very fearful of the agricultural competition that might happen after this agreement comes into force. So the Commission, as Carlos said, is considering splitting the agreement and just going ahead with the trade part and leaving for now the political pillars of the agreement. And for that, we only need qualified majority in the Council. So the few member states that are currently against it couldn't block it. Of course, there's some democratic issues, in my opinion, with doing that. And in any case, the Parliament, the European Parliament, would still have to give its consent. And the European Parliament actually published a resolution saying that the text as it is now wouldn't be good enough for them to give their consent. However, the EU is currently negotiating with the Mercosur side to possibly create a additional declaration, some sort of document that will be annexed to the trade agreement to address some of the issues that the member states and also the Parliament have, mainly in relation to deforestation. So it's very difficult to say what's going to happen. So as Carlos said, if they don't split the agreement, if they keep it as it is with the political pillar, it will also have to go through every single member state parliament. And that's what's just happening to CETA, to the investment part of CETA, and it proves very difficult. That's that. And then I think the power relationship that Laura noted, it's very, very key in the context of this topic. So when two regions come together and agree on trade relations and also possibly, hopefully, some sustainability standards, how it will affect differently each region. And I said before that within the WTO, within the World Trade Organization, environmental aspects weren't considered very much. And one reason why this was the case is also because developing countries were always a bit concerned that developed countries will use environmental laws as protectionist measures, because for developing countries it's always a bit harder to comply with higher sustainability standards than for developed countries, of course. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't create sustainability standards and condition trade on the basis of sustainability standards. You just have to be really aware of the power imbalance, and also factors like, for example, the EU's historic climate debt that it has in relation to developing countries that haven't caused so much CO2 emissions, or as much CO2 emissions as the EU. So you have to work with these components, I think, and one way to do it, one way we did it in our academic statement, is to say, yeah, the EU needs to cooperate with the Mercosur region and needs to help them financially to increase sustainability standards and to stop deforestation. Yeah, I think that was all I wanted to say. Oh, I actually have a question for Johannes, if I may. I thought it was great that he addressed gender inequality, and I would have liked to know what he thinks is a good way of addressing gender inequality in a trade agreement. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sophia, for the question. If I may, I will first go for the other question and then come back to yours, because I still have to think about. But quick to Kun's remark, I hope I spelled that name correct. Just to add, I mean, interestingly, in Germany held the council presidency, and now Portugal is re-pushing or strengthening again the efforts from the European side to push the agreement. And I find that very interesting that Portugal, which of course has long ties to Latin America because of colonialism, but also among other things, I found it interesting that the German council presidency, Germany is very export oriented, rather decided for the investment agreement with China. I found that interesting, just to mention that. And yeah, political forces in Europe is one thing, and with regard to your question, and also in Latin America. I mean, political volatility is very high in Latin America. 2022, there will be presidential elections in Brazil. I mean, with regard to Mercosur, there was the presidential shift from Macri in Argentina to Fernandez. So I think this is also important to consider. With regard to Adrian's question, with regard to representation, I just in my mind came the Brazilian meat industry. I mean, if you look to not only meat production, but also to soybean production, this is, I think, yeah, these are the major business interests in the meat industry by JBS or by Mafrig, which are, yeah, also, I think JBS also donated money to the Donald Trump re-election campaign. So this is, yeah, I think a crucial component to your, I think, very right question with regard to representation and representation of interests. I mean, there are hardcore business interests here at stake, and in the meat production, but also in the soybean production. And with regard to Laura, what can Latin America offer? I would opt for more regional and combined regional integration. I mean, we have Mercosur, we have ALBA, UNASUR, Pacific Alliance, where I also think Pacific Alliance is an interesting model to view, but maybe is there any opportunity to create a common market? Yeah, I mean, the EU started also as a customs union and gradually developed itself into a common market. And I think Mercosur and also Alianza del Pacifico are going into that, more or less going into that direction. So I would recommend to offer to build power is yeah, to come together and try to speak with one voice. And now Sophia's question, could you kindly repeat the question, because I got lost.
Yes, of course. So I was saying that I think it's a really good point that you're making, that gender inequality should be something that is that should be addressed in a trade agreement. Maybe I misunderstood you, and you weren't saying that it should be addressed in the trade agreement directly. But if you did, I would be interested to know what you think is a good way of addressing it. What kind of mechanism do you think would be good to address this issue?
Yeah, I mean, in the agreement, I think I searched it in one thing to criticize. I found the agreement, the text on Greenpeace side, not on the European Commission side, which is, I think, nuts. Yeah. So, but I typed in and searched for gender and women, and gender equality appeared like 11 times. But I think what trade agreements are capable, and the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development nicely elaborated a toolbook for gender neutrality. And this is like to emphasize, to as far as I understood it, to create mechanism to really analyze your country or the common market you will do, you will agree trade, or will, how you say, you will make a trade agreement with, and to analyze how are different sectors, business sectors, affected. In this toolbook, they used the example of Kenya, and I think they went to the flower sector, like, okay, how will the flower sector, because that's an important issue in Kenya, how will it be affected through a trade agreement with the European Union? And I think doing such analysis for different business sectors, I think if you include it in trade agreements, trade deals, I think you can boost gender equality. Besides, I think maybe this is also a question to the guests, but also to you, Carlos and Sophia, is, are we overloading trade agreements with regulations, you know, with sustainability, environment, gender? I mean, these are very important issues, but with regard to climate, I wasn't wondering, why isn't the EU trying to opt for a climate deal, you know, not a trade agreement, but a climate agreement, in order to tackle specifically these issues? I don't know if this is not making sense, but what you think, also the guests, what are your views?
Yes, so I think that unfortunately we have already, so yeah, the time is now, it comes to the end, unfortunately. But yeah, maybe the guests, Carlos and Sophia, want very briefly react to this Johannes statement, and maybe also in form of a last, or no, let me reverse that. So now that the time has proceeded, let's do it in this way. Our guests may have a final statement to end the debate. So let's now start with the order again, Carlos, Sophia, and Johannes, with just 1 or 2 sentences, just a final note, just what should be our takeaway today, and then Karina will have has her final notes.
Okay. In few words, answering Johannes, I don't think that Brazil would sign any climate agreement, environmental agreement, but if it was not tied to trade, and so for sure that's a lot of things there, but it wouldn't even exist if it was not tied to trade. And even in the trade agreement, we have in the intellectual properties chapter that is much more enforceable, for example, in comparison to trade and to sustainable development, human rights, gender equality, and things like that. Well, in a nutshell, trying to summarize what we have seen here, I think it was very rich for me to listen, to discuss, to answer the questions, and trade agreements, they have loopholes, and they need to, as a whole, as a principle, or as an intention, demands trust, and demands coherence. And if EU has its sustainability goals, and if it says that we will act through trade to ensure that the world moves towards the same level of ambition, it needs to be coherent enough to understand that there are loopholes in this trade agreement and in other trade agreements on issues related to environment. If it wants to make it better, it needs to do a lot. And there's a lot of recommendations, including our own statement and a series of studies related specifically to the trade agreement between EU and Mercosur that could help EU and all the Mercosur parties to make it better, to ensure that we'll deliver its promises. And we might see some political moves soon, especially because of the political conditions here in EU, and also because it's raining in the Amazon region, and we won't see for a couple of months too much forest fires, image of destruction, and what provides some, let's say, some calm and tranquility for politicians to say, well, let's take advantage of this moment to make things to happen, and later on we will address these issues. I would like to keep the conversation going on. Thank you very much, Karina, and you guys for inviting me for this, and I'll be glad to join any further discussion. And feel free to contact me if you have specific questions on what I've said. I'll be glad to do that, to speak to you guys. Thank you very much.
Yeah, regarding Johannes's last question, I think the way the TSD chapters address sustainability now, so focusing on the domestic law of the parties, indeed, I think there's an argument to be made that why don't we have a climate agreement rather than a trade agreement with climate commitments. But what I would like to see is a trade agreement that creates preferential trading conditions only for the good kind of trade, only for sustainable trade. So there, I think it's a very, very close link between these two policy fields that really need to be exploited. And with regards to my last statement, I think the trade policy of the EU Commission, or of the EU maybe in general, is getting it a little bit wrong in my opinion. So the way the Commission sees it, trade is an end in and of itself. It's like a value in and of itself. So more trade is better. What I think should be changed is trade and trade agreements, trade policies should be devised in a way that serves specific societal aims. So for example, to alleviate climate change, to protect the environment, to alleviate social inequalities. So there should be defined aims and then trade policies to meet those aims, rather than blindly increasing trade with no real aim except to create economic growth. Because I think we're realizing more and more that we're not getting anywhere with that, not anywhere good. So yeah, thank you also for organizing this really interesting event. I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed the discussion too. And yeah, as Carlos, you can contact me, of course, with any additional questions or just to stay in touch. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, just to briefly wrap up my view, or my takeaway, I think I agree with Carlos that particular with sustainability and environment, the EU has to revise and renegotiate this approach. And I think it also, I mean, not revise its foreign policy strategy, but as I try to show, China is on the rise, and to me, yeah, the EU is more obeying towards China, and I would like to see a tougher stance towards this. I also would like to see more efforts from the European Union towards Latin America, because I believe that besides Mercosur, besides trade, there are very long, deep ties and bonds we should really take care of and strengthen. I think it's worth it, and yeah, and I look forward to also to future discussions. Thank you very much for the kind invitation, and yeah, best regards from snowy Hamburg.
Yes, so thank you very much. Just on a final note, I liked Clara's comment and question very much because it touches on the core traditional political science question, which is the question of power, or in this case, unequal power relations among, between, and even within countries, as Carlos mentioned with the agribusiness case. So I just like to add that when we were discussing our proposals in the academic statement, we insisted in focusing not only on sanction and enforcement, but also more on cooperation, trust building, even technical assistance, and share and co-responsibility. So I think that's a good takeaway also for other future negotiations. And with that, I would like to thank you, our speakers, again for the great presentations and the great discussion. Thank you, Arjen, for co-moderating with me the event. And thank you all the participants that were here today with more than 1.5 hours. So I hope to be in touch with all of you and we can have more this type of events in the future, or hopefully, and not more virtual events as Arjen mentioned, but looking forward to see you all again. Thank you and have a good evening.